The mist hung heavy over the English Channel on an autumn morning in 1337. In London, a young King Edward III stood before his council, making a declaration that would spark over a century of warfare. He was the rightful King of France. With these words, he set in motion one of the longest and most transformative conflicts in European history. The roots of the conflict ran deep into the soil of feudal politics. When the last direct Capetian King of France, Charles IV, died without a male heir in 1328, the French nobility faced a crucial decision. The nearest male relative through the male line was Edward III of England, whose mother Isabella was Charles IV's sister. However, the French nobles, unwilling to see their kingdom ruled by an English king, invoked Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line. They instead crowned Philip of Valois as Philip VI, setting the stage for decades of conflict. By 1337, tensions had reached a breaking point. Philip VI had begun interfering with England's profitable wool trade with Flanders and had confiscated the Duchy of Gascony, a vital English possession in southwestern France. Edward III, young and ambitious, saw his chance. He assembled a powerful alliance of Low Countries rulers, funded by English wool money and Italian banking houses. The first phase of the war demonstrated a crucial reality. While England could win battles, conquering France would prove far more challenging. In 1340, Edward's fleet achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Sluys, destroying the French navy and securing English control of the Channel. This triumph marked the birth of English naval power, but it was only the beginning. Edward's eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, would emerge as one of the war's most compelling figures. In 1346, father and son led an audacious chevauchée raid through Normandy, culminating in one of the most famous battles in military history, Crécy. At Crécy, English longbowmen devastated the cream of French chivalry. The French knights, proud and undisciplined, charged uphill into a storm of arrows. The result was a massacre that shattered the myth of French invincibility. The Black Prince, only 16, earned his spurs that day, fighting in the thick of battle while commanding the right wing of his father's army. Just as the English seemed poised to press their advantage, nature intervened with devastating effect. The Black Death reached Europe in 1347, killing roughly a third of the continent's population. The plague temporarily halted major military operations, but when fighting resumed, it was with even greater ferocity. The war's first phase reached its climax in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers. The Black Prince, now a seasoned commander, found himself trapped in central France by a much larger French army led by King John II. Rather than flee, he chose his ground carefully and turned to face his pursuers. The resulting battle was another triumph of English tactical superiority. The French army was not merely defeated, it was destroyed, and King John himself was captured. This catastrophe forced France to sue for peace, leading to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. The treaty marked a high point for English ambitions. Edward III renounced his claim to the French crown, but secured full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine. England also received a massive ransom for King John's release. Yet this settlement, which might have ended the war, would prove to be merely a pause in the conflict. As the sun set on this first phase of the war, neither side could have imagined that this was only the beginning of a struggle that would transform both nations and define medieval Europe for generations to come. The Treaty of Bretigny had given England control over nearly a third of France, but peace would prove as fragile as morning frost. The next phase of the war would see France rise from the ashes of defeat, led by one of history's most remarkable kings, while England's early triumphs began to slip away like sand through an hourglass. The aftermath of Bretigny revealed the treaty's fundamental weakness. It failed to address the deep-seated antagonisms between the two kingdoms. English nobles in Aquitaine struggled to manage their new independence, while French nobles chafed under foreign rule. The peace was further undermined by the activities of the free companies, bands of unemployed soldiers who ravaged the countryside, serving as a constant reminder of war's brutal legacy. In 1364, France crowned a new king who would change the course of the war. Charles V, known as the Wise, was everything his predecessors were not: patient, strategic, and modern in his thinking. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had led from the front only to suffer catastrophic defeats, Charles preferred to direct operations from his library in the Louvre, surrounded by maps and manuscripts. Charles's greatest innovation was his choice of commander, Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight of modest birth but extraordinary tactical skill. Together, they would revolutionize French military strategy. Du Guesclin abandoned the traditional French reliance on heavy cavalry and pitched battles that had proved so disastrous at Crécy and Poitiers. Instead, he adopted what contemporaries called la guerre couverte, a strategy of raids, ambushes, and careful siege warfare. The French would refuse battle against English strengths, instead targeting their weaknesses, isolated garrisons, supply lines, and the challenge of controlling hostile territory. The war reignited in 1369 when Charles V declared that Edward III had breached the Treaty of Bretigny through his mismanagement of Aquitaine. The Black Prince, now ruler of Aquitaine, responded with one of the most controversial episodes of the war, the sack of Limoges. Already suffering from the illness that would eventually kill him, the prince ordered the city's destruction after it defected to the French. The massacre that followed shocked medieval sensibilities and tarnished the prince's reputation for chivalry. More importantly, it demonstrated the limitations of English rule through terror. For every city they destroyed, two more would rebel. The 1370s marked a steady deterioration of the English position in France. Du Guesclin's tactics proved devastatingly effective. Major English expeditions, including the 1373 Great March, led by Joan of Gaunt, crossed France with impunity, but failed to bring the French to battle or achieve any lasting gains. Instead, these campaigns exhausted English resources, while French forces systematically recaptured castles and towns. The war at sea intensified during this period. French and Castilian galleys raided England's south coast, burning towns like Rye and Hastings. The English responded with their own raids, but could no longer maintain the naval supremacy they had won at Sluys. The Channel, once England's protective moat, became a contested battleground. By the late 1370s, the great figures of the war's first phase were passing from the scene. The Black Prince died in 1376, followed by Edward III in 1377. The new English king, Richard II, was only 10 years old. In France, Charles V died in 1380, leaving the throne to his young son, Charles VI. Both kingdoms would now face the challenges of royal minorities. Charles V's reign marked a crucial turning point in French military organization. He created France's first standing army, implemented new taxation systems to support it, and developed a professional officer corps. These reforms would outlive him and provide the foundation for eventual French victory. The war's expense led to increased taxation in both kingdoms, contributing to social unrest. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook the foundations of feudal society. Though suppressed, it demonstrated how the war was transforming both societies, creating new social pressures and opportunities. The period concluded with renewed fighting in Flanders, where England supported the city of Ghent's rebellion against their French-aligned count. The eventual French victory at Rosebecca, 1382, demonstrated their military revival and secured their northern frontier. By 1389, exhaustion led both sides to agree to the Second Treaty of London, establishing a temporary truce. But this pause, like the Treaty of Bretigny before it, would prove temporary. The stage was set for the most dramatic phase of the war, when both kingdoms would face internal crises that would shake them to their foundations. As England's grip on France weakened, neither side could foresee the even greater dramas that lay ahead. The madness of kings, the triumph of Welsh and French rebels, and the rise of a peasant girl who would change everything. The period following the Second Treaty of London would prove to be one of the most chaotic in the history of both kingdoms. As one king descended into madness and another was deposed, the war entered a new phase marked by civil strife, political assassination, and the rise of one of medieval England's most famous warriors. The tragedy began in the summer of 1392, during a military expedition to Brittany. Without warning, Charles VI, then 24, attacked his own men in a sudden fit of violent madness. This first episode marked the beginning of a lifelong affliction that would plunge France into chaos. During his periods of lucidity, Charles could still rule effectively, but these became increasingly rare. The king, who had once been known as Charles the Beloved, became Charles the Mad, and his condition would have devastating consequences for France. Into the power vacuum created by Charles's illness stepped his ambitious uncles and brother, the Dukes of Berry, Burgundy, Orleans, and Bourbon. These princes of the blood began a complex struggle for control of the kingdom, with the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans emerging as the primary antagonists. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, had built an impressive territorial empire that included not only Burgundy, but also Flanders and other Low Countries territories. His wealth from the cloth trade and his control of Paris made him the most powerful figure in France. After his death in 1404, his son John the Fearless continued his policies with even greater aggression. Louis of Orleans, the king's brother, represented the opposing faction. Brilliant, cultured, and thoroughly ambitious, he built his own power base in central France and cultivated close ties with the queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. This relationship led to scandalous rumors and deepened political divisions. The rivalry between Burgundians and Orleanists exploded into violence on November 23, 1407. As Louis of Orleans rode through the darkened streets of Paris, assassins attacked and literally hacked him to pieces. John the Fearless initially denied responsibility, but later brazenly admitted to ordering the murder, claiming it was a justified act of tyrannicide. This assassination shattered the peace of the realm. France descended into civil war between the Burgundians and their opponents, now led by the young Charles of Orleans and his father-in-law Bernard Armagnac. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War would paralyze France just as a new threat emerged across the Channel. England, too, faced a period of political crisis. Richard II, who had survived the peasants' revolt as a boy, grew into an increasingly autocratic ruler. His attempts to build an absolute monarchy and his persecution of the powerful nobility led to his downfall. In 1399, while Richard was on campaign in Ireland, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile, gathered support, and deposed him. Henry IV, as Bolingbroke became, faced numerous challenges to his rule. Rebellions broke out in Wales, where Owen Glendower proclaimed himself Prince of Wales and established an independent principality. In the north, the powerful Percy family, who had supported Henry's usurpation, turned against him. Even the Scots took advantage of England's weakness to raid the borders. It was in this crucible of rebellion and civil strife that Henry VI's son, the future Henry V, learned the art of warfare and governance. Despite, or perhaps because of, his notorious youth spent in London's taverns, the young prince proved to be an exceptional military commander and political operator. By the time he succeeded his father in 1413, he had already earned a reputation as a skilled warrior and leader. Henry V ascended the throne with a clear vision. He would reunite England through foreign conquest and press his claim to the French throne. The timing seemed perfect. France was paralyzed by civil war. Charles VI was incapacitated, and both Burgundians and Armagnacs seemed willing to negotiate with England to gain advantage over their domestic rivals. During the Long Peace, both kingdoms had continued to develop militarily. The English perfected their combination of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen, while also developing siege warfare capabilities. The French, despite their civil war, maintained the military reforms of Charles V and developed a powerful artillery arm. The period also saw the Western Schism, with competing popes in Rome and Avignon, further complicating international politics. The Church's attempts to mediate between England and France were undermined by this division, which also reflected the broader split between the kingdoms. Just as Henry V prepared to launch his invasion of France in 1415, he uncovered a conspiracy to depose him in favor of Edmund Mortimer, the Earl of March. The Southampton Plot, as it became known, demonstrated both the continuing instability of Lancastrian rule and Henry's skill in handling internal threats. The conspirators were executed, and Henry used the plot to strengthen his position before embarking for France. As Henry V's invasion fleet prepared to sail in August 1415, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic periods of the entire war. France, divided between Burgundians and Armagnacs, seemed ripe for conquest. Yet the campaign that followed would test English arms to their limit and produce one of the most famous battles in military history. The next chapter would see the triumph of Agincourt, the Treaty of Troyes, and Henry V's brief moment as heir to both England and France. But even these successes would prove fleeting in the face of France's remarkable resilience. The dawn of August 11, 1415, saw nearly 1,000 ships set sail from Southampton, carrying Henry V and his army toward France. None aboard could have imagined how their campaign would reshape the war and enter into legend, nor could they have foreseen how a peasant girl would eventually arise to challenge everything they would achieve. Henry V's initial objective was modest: the capture of Harfleur, a strategic port at the mouth of the Seine. The siege proved far more difficult than expected, lasting over a month and costing the English army dearly through disease and combat. When Harfleur finally fell on September 22nd, Henry faced a crucial decision. With his army severely depleted, he chose not to return to England, but instead to march through Normandy to Calais, deliberately provoking the French into battle. The march north became increasingly perilous as a large French army shadowed the English force. Autumn rains turned roads to mud, supplies ran low, and dysentery continued to weaken the troops. The French, learning from past defeats, refused battle while waiting for more reinforcements to arrive. They finally forced Henry to give battle near the village of Agincourt on October 25, 1415. Dawn broke on St. Crispin's Day to reveal a scenario that seemed to spell doom for the English. Their army of perhaps 6,000 men faced a French force that may have numbered 20,000 or more. However, several factors would turn this apparent mismatch into one of history's most famous victories. The battlefield itself proved crucial. Recent plowing had turned the field to mud after heavy rains. The French had positioned themselves between two woodlands, which forced them to compress their lines, negating their numerical advantage and creating deadly crowding in their ranks. Henry deployed his army in the traditional English fashion: dismounted men-at-arms in the center, flanked by wedges of archers protected by sharpened stakes. The French, perhaps learning the wrong lessons from previous defeats, placed their cavalry on the flanks rather than in the vanguard. The battle began with a long period of inaction, as each side waited for the other to attack. Finally, the French advanced, directly into a storm of English arrows. The muddy ground and the weight of their armor caused many French knights to literally sink into the field. Those who reached the English lines were exhausted, and the battle devolved into a bloody melee. A French attack on the English baggage train led Henry to order the execution of his prisoners, a controversial decision that shocked contemporaries but reflected the desperate nature of the fighting. By day's end, the French army had been destroyed. Among the dead were many of France's leading nobles, including Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France. Rather than immediately exploit his victory, Henry returned to England to recruit a new army and prepare for a systematic conquest of Normandy. The campaign that followed, from 1417 to 1419, demonstrated his strategic abilities and understanding of siege warfare. One by one, Norman cities fell to English arms: Caen, Falaise, Cherbourg, and finally Rouen after a brutal 6-month siege. Henry combined ruthless pressure with generous terms for surrender, gradually establishing control over the entire duchy. The French Civil War continued to aid English conquest. In 1419, an attempt at reconciliation between the Burgundian and Armagnac factions ended in disaster when Duke John the Fearless was murdered during a meeting with the Dauphin Charles on the bridge at Montereau. The assassination drove the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, into alliance with England. This Anglo-Burgundian alliance led to the remarkable Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Under its terms: 1. Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI. 2. Henry would become regent of France during Charles VI's lifetime. 3. Upon Charles VI's death, Henry would inherit the French crown. 4. The Dauphin Charles was disinherited. The treaty represented the high-water mark of English ambition in France. Henry V seemed poised to unite the crowns of both kingdoms, creating a dual monarchy that might have changed the course of European history. Yet fate had other plans. Henry V died suddenly in 1422, probably of dysentery, leaving his 9-month-old son Henry VI as heir to both kingdoms. Charles VI followed him to the grave 2 months later. Instead of a warrior king uniting two realms, both kingdoms now faced the prospect of long regencies. John, Duke of Bedford, became regent for the young Henry VI in France. A capable ruler and commander, he worked to consolidate English control north of the Loire River. The Dauphin Charles, dubbed the King of Bourges in mockery of his limited authority, controlled the territory south of the Loire. By 1429, the English position seemed secure. They and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris, Normandy, and much of northern France. They began a campaign to extend their control south of the Loire, laying siege to Orléans, the last major city protecting the Dauphin's territory. Yet it was at this moment of apparent English triumph that the most remarkable figure of the entire war would emerge. From the village of Domremy came a young peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, claiming divine visions and a mission to save France. Her arrival would mark the beginning of an extraordinary reversal of fortune. The maid appears. As episode 4 closes, Joan arrives at the Dauphin's court in Chinon, beginning a sequence of events that would transform the war. She promised to fulfill 3 tasks. 1. Lift the siege of Orleans. 2. See the Dauphin crowned at Reims. 3. Drive the English from France. Few took her seriously at first, but desperation led the Dauphin to give her a chance. What followed would become legend. The arrival of Joan of Arc marked the beginning of one of history's most remarkable military and spiritual transformations. In less than 2 years, this teenage peasant girl would help turn the tide of a century-long war, though she would not live to see its conclusion. Her story, and the final chapter of this epic conflict, would demonstrate how faith, nationalism, and military innovation would reshape medieval Europe. When Joan arrived at Orléans in April 1429, the city had been under siege for 7 months. The English had built a ring of fortified positions around the city, gradually tightening their grip. The fate of France seemed to hang on Orléans' survival. If it fell, there would be nothing to prevent English dominion south of the Loire. Historians still debate Joan's exact military role, but contemporary accounts suggest several crucial contributions. 1. She boosted troop morale dramatically. 2. She advocated for aggressive tactics rather than the cautious approach favored by veteran commanders. 3. She demonstrated remarkable physical courage, often standing exposed to enemy fire to encourage her troops. 4. She showed an intuitive grasp of artillery placement and siege warfare. Over 9 days in May 1429, Joan led a series of attacks that systematically destroyed the English siege positions. The psychological impact was enormous. English troops, convinced they faced divine intervention, began to show signs of panic. On May 8th, the English lifted the siege and withdrew, marking their first major reversal in years. Rather than rest after Orléans, Joan pressed for immediate action. The subsequent Loire Valley campaign demonstrated a new aggressiveness in French operations. 1. The Battle of Jargeau, June 12th. English forces were driven from their stronghold. 2. The Battle of Mont-sur-Loire, June 15th. Another English fortress fell. 3. The Battle of Beaugency, June 17th. The English lost their last major Loire River position. 4. The Battle of Patay, June 18th. A decisive French victory in open battle that shattered English military prestige. Joan's next goal was equally ambitious: to have the Dauphin crowned King of France at Reims. The traditional coronation site lay deep in enemy territory, but Joan insisted on the journey. The campaign became a triumphal progress as city after city opened its gates to the Dauphin's army. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned in Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing beside him holding her standard. The symbolic importance of this event cannot be overstated. France once again had a properly anointed king. Joan's subsequent campaigns met with mixed success. An attack on Paris in September 1429 failed and she was wounded. However, the psychological damage to English authority had been done. More importantly, the French had regained their confidence and developed new military capabilities. 1. French artillery became increasingly sophisticated and mobile. 2. Professional standing companies replaced feudal levies. 3. A new generation of commanders emerged, trained in aggressive tactics. 4. The French developed effective countermeasures against English longbow tactics. In May 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces during a skirmish near Compiègne. The English, determined to destroy her influence, purchased her from the Burgundians and arranged for her trial on charges of heresy. The proceedings that followed would become infamous. 1. The trial was presided over by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, an English partisan. 2. Joan faced a battery of theological experts who tried to trap her with complex questions. 3. She demonstrated remarkable composure and intelligence in her responses. 4. The trial transcripts reveal both her courage and the political nature of the proceedings. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen marketplace. She was 19 years old. Her last words were, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." The English hoped her execution would end her influence. Instead, it transformed her into a martyr and symbol of French resistance. The war continued for another 22 years after Joan's death, but the momentum had shifted decisively. In 1435, the Congress of Arras saw the Burgundians abandon their English alliance. Duke Philip the Good recognized Charles VII as King of France in exchange for significant concessions. This diplomatic revolution isolated the English and exposed their position in northern France. In 1436, Paris, the greatest city in Western Europe, returned to French control. The city's liberation marked a crucial psychological victory for the French cause. Charles VII proved to be a more capable ruler than anyone had expected. His military reforms created Europe's first standing army since Roman times. 1. The ordnance companies provided professional cavalry. 2. The Franks archer system created a trained infantry reserve. 3. Royal artillery became the most advanced in Europe. The last phase of the war saw systematic French reconquest. 1. Normandy was recovered in 1450. 2. Gascony, the last English territory in southern France, fell in 1451. 3. The Battle of Castillon, 1453, marked the final English defeat. Castillon was significant not only as the war's last battle, but also as a demonstration of how warfare had changed. English forces charged French artillery positions and were massacred. The day of the longbow and mounted knight was passing. The war's conclusion left both kingdoms transformed. France, 1. Emerged as the strongest kingdom in Western Europe. 2. Developed the first modern standing army. 3. Experienced a surge of national consciousness. 4. Saw the monarchy greatly strengthened. England, 1. Lost all continental possessions except Calais. 2. Entered a period of internal crisis, Wars of the Roses. 3. Began to develop a more insular island identity. 4. Saw the end of its dreams of continental empire. The 100 Years' War marked the end of medieval warfare and the beginning of the modern age. 1. National identity replaced feudal loyalty. 2. Professional armies replaced feudal levies. 3. Gunpowder weapons became decisive. 4. The power of central monarchy increased. 5. Popular participation in warfare grew. 6. New concepts of nationalism emerged. Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint in 1920, but her influence had been felt long before. She represented something new in European history: the common person as agent of God and nation, an inspiration that continues to resonate. The war that had begun over feudal rights ended as a conflict between emerging nations, marking the transition from medieval to early modern Europe. The long struggle had forged two distinct kingdoms, each with its own sense of identity and destiny, setting the stage for centuries of rivalry to come.